Plateau 7 of 1,000 plateaus, ATP, is on faciality, and it offers all the classic problems associated with reading Deleuze and Guattari. It's a veritable masterpiece of French elite academic style. There are all sorts of casual asides to novels by D.H. Lawrence or Henry Miller, mentions of work by Sartre and Lacan, a quick discussion of American psychoanalysis, paintings, music, epics of medieval knighthood, and some recent work in embryology. Some examples just get a small paragraph as a kind of passing thought, like the ones on bouncing balls in Kafka and the Nijinsky ballet, or a discussion of the facial tic. This weird collection of examples is perhaps intended to show the universality and cultural significance of the faciality system, but only a philosopher could see any of this as evidence. There's a lot of repetition. Some sources are more explicit and adequately referenced, but not all. Some references are still in French, of course. We have some very abstract theorems relating to general issues and some horrible little scrappy diagrams. There's also some philosophical thinking aloud of the kind that can look like evasiveness. Maybe it is evasiveness. If you have lots of time and leisure as I do at the moment, it's a treasure house, and I have much enjoyed tracking down some of the references and exploring them. However, if you are a hard-pressed student trying to get some basic argument out of this work, it must be deeply frustrating. Well, those are the people I'm addressing in this video. As usual, therefore, I'm going to stratify my offering. The video script will focus on the main points and just mention what I take to be the main issues insofar as I can grasp them, but the transcript includes a few extra comments to cover a bit more background. Let's get on with the main argument as I see it. We are told from the start that we are going to consider how two forces are going to be integrated together. We have already met these forces in the previous plateau on the body without organs. There's a video on it too. The two forces are signifiance and subjectification. Signifiance relates to the ways in which what is seen as the proper construction of language controls us and what we can say. Subjectification describes the ways in which subjective identities are made available to us, and these also limit the potential of what we can do and think. You might remember that we saw these two forces initially as enemies of the BWO, the body without organs. We've also mentioned faciality, I think, in the video on the refrain. We are told that D and G are going to operate as usual at two levels. Slightly unusually, we're going to discuss the abstract system first, whereas in the other plateaus it is often the other way around. So first there is the virtual or pure level, dealing with an abstract system or machine of faciality. This will operate across a wide range of examples, regardless of the content, as they say on page 196. Secondly, there are some actual examples. The virtual system takes the form of an abstract machine technically capable of producing the whole range of possible combinations of the forces involved. But the concrete and actualized possibilities are produced by additional social and political forces in the context in which we are operating. The actual examples here largely turn on the role of the human face, as usually understood, in social and political life and in art. We are told that this is a really important discussion for understanding human culture, humanity itself, the most general features of modern social life, none of which need actually resemble the conventional human face at all. This is because the virtual system is inhuman. We would expect this inhumanity with any abstract or machinic system that operates at the level of impersonal universal forces operating behind cultural life. Understanding the faciality system in its full impersonality becomes important if we are to escape it, as we shall see. We need to develop new machinic possibilities altogether, something that they call probe heads. We are also told early on that the notion of becoming something other than conventionally human is going to be important, so there's a link with the discussion of becoming that we've had elsewhere. At the virtual level, the basic components of machinic faciality can be understood as a white screen and a black hole, combined in various ways. We are told in What is Philosophy, that's Deleuze and Guattari 1994, that Deleuze was intrigued by white screens from his interest in cinema, and he saw white screens as an important component upon which particular messages, sequences of language or symbols are projected. The most literal and concrete example of the face is the one often seen in cinema or photography, the washed out, overexposed white face with contrasting black eyes. The notion of a screen can be used to refer to any surface upon which messages are projected, not just cinema screens. And incidentally, this just might be where the notion of a landscape fits in. Such messages are going to be treated as powerful forms of social conformity and control, and this view of language is argued strongly in the other plateaus as well. The notion of a black hole comes from Guattari and his work on psychoanalysis, for example, Guattari 1995, that's chaosmosis. The most concrete way to think of it is as a description of catatonic patients. All sorts of people attempt to direct communication at them, but nothing comes back, just as no information or light comes out of a black hole in astronomy. The black hole appears in Guattari's work more generally to represent what we normally experience as personal consciousness or personal passions, experienced as an inward dimension, a feeling that something is going on inside us, something personal to us, something not necessarily socially shared. Ordinary subjectivity can degenerate into the more pathological catatonic kind if individuals obsess so much about their personal feelings that they develop black holes. We're talking about the sort of obsession with self that you occasionally find with great writers or with those in the grip of consuming personal passions. One of Proust's characters, Swann, shows such an obsession as we shall see, and there might be another example in the lover's fatal passions in Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde. I haven't seen this opera, and I tried the Wikipedia account for a first step. This opera is obviously quite important to Deleuze and Guattari because faciality in this opera even gets its own diagram on page 205. Components are always combined together in the system, so a sense of personal subjectivity is therefore integrated with social messages being projected onto various social surfaces and carried by ordinary language. This means that human subjectivity is never completely autonomous, it is always integrated with patterns of significance. In this way, social systems themselves provide a number of positions for us, even though we think of those as our own free forms of subjectivity. Well, for me, this is the abiding political theme that runs throughout this plateau and elsewhere, and it might be something to think about in particular for those of us in Anglo-American societies who tend to think that the individual person can escape, resist, or even challenge social and linguistic arrangements by developing our own subjectivity and creativity. A number of French thinkers have always been far more pessimistic about this. For them, subjectivity does not spontaneously arise from individuals, but is itself constructed through processes that make us think we are autonomous, but which also require us to conform to existing social arrangements. I think that this pessimistic, or realistic if you prefer, notion of subjectivity can be found in most of the other plateaus as well. This obviously disagrees with those who see Deleuze, with or without Guattari, as an advocate of the sort of entirely subjective approaches to research that you see in developments such as autoethnography. I have developed my own view on this in a recent open access publication, Harris 2018. It's a free download. Turning to concrete examples, we find references to work in American psychology on the perception of the child, a topic which is discussed elsewhere quite a lot as well. Particular criticism here is directed at Freud, but also at one of his disciples, Josie Klein. She has developed an argument to include the importance of things she calls part objects. I understand these are also known as transitional objects in Winnicott's work. These are important in the infant's growing understanding of the external world. Objects such as perceptions of the mother's breast or face are understood both as part of the integrated passional world of the infant and, increasingly, as external real objects in their own right. Guattari in particular has frequently discussed the pros and cons of this particular approach. For example, in Guattari 2014, that's the one on ecology, the three ecologies. Here in ATP, the approach is being criticised as claiming to be universal as part of some inevitable stage of development. Deleuze and Guattari themselves prefer a different model of development, one described as a matter of intensive forces arriving at different speeds in the development of children. We actually have a rather implicit reference here to some background work on embryology, which denies the existence of any fixed blueprint and refers instead to abstract biochemical and forces in the embryo, which territorialize or re-territorialize in different places and different times, with subsequent effects on other flows. I think Delander's commentary, Delander 2002, is the clearest here. Freudian psychology sees its own approach as science, though, and the actual words of the patient are always translated into the scientific terms. This takes place particularly in the dangerously authoritarian face-to-face context of conventional Freudian psychotherapeutic practice. This face-to-face system is represented as, and I quote, a four-eye machine, although that is not entirely clear here. The term is used explicitly to refer to Anglo-American psychiatric practice. In Guattari's own version of the dialogues that led to 1000 Plateau, his book called The Machinic Unconscious, that's Guattari 2011. We can also find in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari 1984, Freudian psychology described as an example of biunivocalization, a term discussed in a minute. I offer a brief summary of the critique of the Oedipus complex in a short paragraph on the transcript if you want to follow it up. The text then goes on to provide us with a casual and unreferenced aside about the work of Sartre and Lacan, and how the discussion of faciality helps to logically proceed and properly ground their work. They use terms like the look and the mirror phase, respectively, to describe the emergence of subjectivity, and I have an aside again referenced in the transcript to spell out some of these implications. Then we go on to various theorems relating to deterritorialization. That concept is, of course, important to other discussions in ATP, including ones about lines of flight, which I think is where we encountered it in this series of videos. These theorems extend the formal qualities of deterritorialization. To give you just the gist of the argument as I understand it, we need this extended discussion to avoid over-simple interpretations of the term. Deterritorialization is a complex matter where elements can be linked with other elements in whole systems or structures. Each element has a different potential for deterritorialization, so various possibilities of contamination or escalation, so to speak, exist, as the deterritorialization of one element affects the others. Faciality shows all these complexities of deterritorialization. Initially it's quite a simple matter when the human face gets deterritorialized from its original setting, the human head. Then a particular historical process ensues which produces further deterritorialization and further relations with other elements, as we shall see in the case of cultural activities. The face indeed offers us an absolute deterritorialization, we're told on page 191, represented as the highly abstract system we've already seen, white screens and black holes. This system will go on to dominate large areas of culture because they re-territorialize on it. This is why we should understand the face quite differently from the ways of understanding bodies, for example. Faces are coded differently, more abstractly. This extensive power of deterritorialization and the potential for having neighbouring components re-territorialize on it explains the cultural role of the faciality system. The face can now overcode a wide range of cultural activity, offering a very general and widely applicable coding system. Well, we have to remember that we're not just looking for simple resemblances between faces and other cultural elements. Rather, we're trying to find the same machinic operations. Incidentally, the underlying system is described here as a surface with holes, and this is discussed very briefly right at the end of the plateau on smooth space. How did the faciality system develop? It's not essentially human. It draws on inhuman forces. It's not just that faces appear as inhuman in certain circumstances, in very large close-ups for example. The faciality system is not the result of an evolution or a necessary stage of development. In particular, it has nothing to do with psychoanalytic stages of the development of human subjects, as we saw. It doesn't involve ideology in the usual limited sense, that is, where deliberate strategic communication is involved. Instead, it's a more abstract issue of what they call, and I quote, economy and the organisation of power. I translate that as saying the faciality system is a very powerful and flexible way to overcode human life. Social power has not always been exercised through faciality. In what they call primitive societies, that's page 195, there's a different semiotic, something, and I quote, essentially collective, polyvocal and corporeal, expressed in a variety of forms and substances, but usually involving bodies and the control of them. Speech, symbolism and ritual act as forms of bodily control. These can achieve some limited becomings, usually becomings animal, invoking animal spirits of various kinds in rituals, for example, but more abstract forms of becoming are needed in modern societies. The power of faciality actually emerges with the power of white man, both words capitalized. In other words, with European dominance, symbolized for them by the face of Christ spreading everywhere and becoming the model of the seemingly universal human face, which incidentally is what I understand by the untranslated Latin tag on page 196. Here the system of power works in a new way, focused on the key process, by univocalization. To simplify, univocalization occurs when a single speaker voices a statement that reflects their own understandings and beliefs. Bivocalization clearly involves two people speaking and making statements. However, biunivocalization describes a situation where two voices may be speaking, but both are offering complementary versions of the same statement, usually the statement offered by the dominant speaker. So, for example, different speakers might take turns to make versions of a statement, but that statement will still reflect the interests of one speaker. An oppressive ruler might make a statement about something, and we might find ordinary citizens offering similar views, apparently quite spontaneously and independently. Or We might have some sort of call and response system where a powerful speaker makes a statement about something, then asks for responses, and the listeners all give personal examples that illustrate and fully agree with his view. We'll add another example in a minute. The faciality system is bi-univocal. Whatever the variations in content, centers and surfaces provide a coherent basic unit with the same underlying logic to express subjective meaning in conventional language. And to do this you need a twofold combination of surface and subjective center. Not only that, the subjective center itself also operates with binary choices, usually, they say, of a simple yes-no type. Here we encounter a further form of bi-univocalization to add to the examples above. Any system that's going to domesticate a complex society and reduce it to binaries like this cannot be too rigid, because it will always have to deal with new cases that emerge now and then. The faciality system also worked to domesticate anything that might be emerging as a challenge. As they put it, the white wall is always expanding and the black hole functions repeatedly. That's page 197. To take their example, if the traditional binary difference between conventional men and conventional women comes under strain, new categories are invented. The example they choose is the category of transvestite. Well, of course, there are many more categories these days. These categories will not necessarily be particularly hostile, but they will still be part of the abstract machine, not something outside that can challenge it. We then lead on to quite an interesting discussion about European racism. We've already seen that faciality is based on the emergence of white man, so non-white people, when they finally appear in the heartlands of Europe, for example, have to be categorized as deviants in the way suggested just now. Now, I thought at this point of some British work on black people and how they finally began to appear on British television. First of all, they appeared as barbaric savages or criminals. Then, increasingly, as slightly more tolerant stereotypes, such as noble savage, talented natural athlete, or musician. Of course, these are all still sometimes used in social discrimination. Deleuze and Guattari argue that none of the categories like this actually grasp very much about otherness. As they put it, racism never detects the particles of the other. That's page 197. In other words, black people are granted a form of licensed otherness on the terms of the system. There is still no recognition of any other kind of otherness outside the system. We learn that, and I quote, language is always embedded in the faces that announce its statements. That's page 199. You might need to remember this argument if you encounter elsewhere, such as in Plato 4, apparently strange statements like that there is no such thing as language in its own right. No separate language also means no separate level of subjectivity either. There are no subjective choices as some sort of prior activity which then gets expressed in language. Subjectivity is not outside of language. Subjective choice presupposes the faciality system and how it has already been constructed with binary signifiers and binary subjective identities. In this sense, and I quote, it is faces that choose their subjects, page 199, not the other way around. That is, the faciality system has constructed human subjects in the first place. Again, we are reminded that linguistic operations and the operations of subjectivity need not look like the same kind of thing, and obviously neither closely resemble a human face, but nevertheless both arise from the abstract operation of faciality. The system, as a result, they're always found combined together. Well, there's some nice examples of painting, and I looked up a Giotto painting of Christ, which is very interesting. I've mentioned it on the transcript. Anyway, certain social formations need faciality systems and also landscapes, we're assured, although I must confess I still don't quite see how landscapes fit in. I've had a try to explain it in my own terms in an aside referenced on the transcript. Our social formation has colonised the earlier systems of power, which were much more polyvocal and far less individualised. We now have a fully modern process of significance and subjectification which tries to deal with all eventualities, largely successfully. Colonisation took place and is maintained precisely because modern systems of significance and subjectification are so abstract, they are so deterritorialised, and thus are generally applicable. Social change has deterritorialised the older systems, but they have not developed new territories of their own. Instead, they've been colonised by highly deterritorialised coding systems, exactly as predicted in the theorems on deterritorialisation, to no surprise. In a bit more detail, there are specific assemblages of power at work, and we're told there are two main kinds, despotic and authoritarian. Both are involved in crushing otherness and dangerous heterogeneity. There is much discussion of these and other power assemblages in Anti-Oedipus. Roughly, a despotic system is based around the presence of a single ruler, leader or institution which monopolises all power and acts everywhere. An authoritarian system is a bit more like our own, more depersonalised, based on institutions that make us conform willingly, and here they mention contracts. Sometimes the two forms are mixed, we are told. There are some additional possibilities as well, and here we get to these curious diagrams. Let's look at the ones on page 203 at first. I've reproduced these in the transcript. They describe cases where there might be moving black holes, for example, or more than two black holes. We can add circles to diagrams to show how the black hole can expand its areas of operation. Inside each new black hole is an eye. In some of these examples, some of them are drawn from a marvellous book on Ethiopian magic scrolls, which again I've summarised and given a reference on the transcript. Black holes can overlap, enter into redundancy as they put it, and this is particularly how despotic systems work, to proliferate the centre of power and spread it across the whole surface. In another case, perhaps describing the modern authoritarian regime, the wall of the signifier becomes something that looks rather more like a line. We're not actually told much more about this, but perhaps it is a personalised version of the signifier. We see such lines in the diagrams on page 205, again reproduced on the transcript. Looking at these diagrams, in some cases it seems the line-bearing signifiers heads towards one dominant black hole. Sometimes opposing faces appear on the lines, perhaps representing either two persons or aspects of the same person, say their rational consciousness and their subjective passions, no doubt linked in a bi-univocal relation. In the third example, it seems as if various kinds of artistic representation can be made to converge, perhaps on one decisive act, like the final scenes of Tristan und Isolde, where more or less everyone dies very passionately. I'm not at all clear, incidentally, why this is called a maritime case, but it might refer to an argument by D.H. Lawrence in an essay on Melville, which they admire. Note 18 for Plateau 7, page 590, says this essay, and I quote, begins with a lovely distinction between terrestrial and maritime eyes. End of quotes. Well, again, I've got a brief comment on this on the transcript. Then we get to a recurrent example, the novel written by Proust, who was, and I quote, able to make the face, landscape, painting, music resonate together. That's page 205. I have my own summary of this novel on my website. In this example, we're reminded how Swann persuades himself that Odette is a beautiful person, worthy of his love, despite being of humble origins and having a dubious reputation as a courtesan. He does this by looking at parts of her face and seeing in them reminders of parts of faces in classical paintings. Specifically, I recall from the novel, she recalls a Giotto painting, Zippera. Incidentally, I understand the Google Arts and Cultures app now helps you do something similar by locating your own selfie in a classical painting. Back to Proust. The same music always seems to be playing whenever Swann meets Odette in various Parisian salons, and he begins to add value to the meetings, to use a rather vulgar phrase found in leisure studies, by associating the meetings with a particularly beautiful musical phrase. However, all these aesthetic efforts push Swann into a crippling obsession with Odette, and he follows all these efforts, and I quote, along a line hurtling towards a single black hole, that of Swann's passion, with a capital P. He is eventually able to escape and put things back in perspective, but only after considerable intellectual reflection on music, trying to separate its effects from subjective feelings, attaining what they call open single quote salvation through art end quote. That is, he finally gets a proper technical understanding of art in its own right, and sees that it doesn't just express subjectivity but has its own internal rules of composition which offer many more possible meanings. Generally, though, we are told that French novels are not very good at helping us get out of black holes. This massive generalization is followed by another one, praising Anglo-American novels which stress the theme of escape, breaking out of social constraints, travelling, and having adventures. However, there's also an awareness that escape is going to be very difficult, as we shall see. The same goes with breaking from conventional significance, and even Christ was unable to do this. He bounced off the wall, is the way they put it on page 207. The trouble is that our culture exerts a massive inertia over any attempt to escape, and this means there are going to be some risks in doing things like becoming animal or becoming imperceptible, and these warnings are found at the end of the plateau as well. We will need to draw upon all the resources of art to resist an escape, especially what they call art of the highest kind, page 208, which probably means that sort of art that engages with philosophy. In some experimental writing you can become animal or become imperceptible, and the same goes with music. We have to be careful, however, that we do not see art as a refuge and allow it to re-territorialize us too early. We have to go all the way instead, as they put it, towards the realms of the a-signifying, a-subjective, and faceless. End of quote. This is risky, and again I quote, madness is a definite danger. Breaking out of faciality will always be a political act, something real, with real consequences. One possibility here is what they call becoming clandestine, which perhaps means avoiding all the usual categories, not conforming willingly, but keeping something back, so that you are no longer open to total control. As usual, however, it is necessary to do some philosophy first, perform some extensive analysis to, and I quote, find your black holes and white walls, so that they might be dismantled, so that we might find lines of flight. We should certainly never be tempted to think of simply returning to become some pre-industrial person again. This will not leave behind the categories that we still think with. As they put it on page 209, when we look at the, and I quote, deep ocean, we will think of the lake in the Bois de Boulogne. Or we find ourselves re-territorialized again. I think this might be, as in the example of going native. For these reasons, a return to some pre-capitalist arrangement is, and I quote, an impossible return, and this is quoting D.H. Lawrence's critique of Melville's novel of noble savagery, Taipei. We should not return, but rather move forward to think of new ways of living. We're told we can't turn back. Instead, we have to find new uses for the walls and black holes we have been given. we need to analyse significance in order to try to develop, and I quote, lines of asignificance. We should escape from memory, try to avoid previous interpretations, and examine our own subjectivity to try and find those particles, as they call them, that have not been domesticated. In our relations with others, we need a kind of transformed love, which is not subjective, which does not attempt to colonize the other, but which sets out to explore otherness as genuinely unknown. Overall, then, the abstract machine of faciality links us to definite political and social strata in a way which offers only limited freedom, a limited form of personal deterritorialization, for example, or it can offer tolerated forms of harmless deviancy. This system colonizes and extends itself consistently, or as they put it, it develops on a plane of consistency. However, there is one liberating possibility here, rather a surprising one. Faciality can produce what they call a probe head, something that searches or guides, that breaks through strata, pierces walls, and escapes holes of subjectivity. Deterritorializations can become more positive and creative. Lines and holes need not form a unified system, nor extend to fully colonized landscapes, painting or music. Faciality traits can be freed to go off and develop rhizomes of their own, linking up with previously unknown aspects of landscapes, painting or music. Now, this probe head arises from a machinic possibility, not actually realized yet, but which is inherent in the abstract system. Overall, current notions of the face, of subjectivity or personhood, are, and I quote, a horror, necessarily inhuman, produced by a machine to serve the interests of apparatuses of power. Even so-called primitive forms are inhuman too, although they combine forces differently with very different natures and speeds. Incidentally, I think we've discussed the notion of speed before, and it refers both to a situation when a force arrives to be combined with others, and also implies the extent to which a force can combine across a range of other forces. We should try to develop what sounds pretty paradoxical, a more liberating inhumanity, the probe head, something which explores and seeks out deterritorialization, as we saw, encourages lines of flight, and helps us develop new forms of becoming and polyvocality. Our slogan might be, and I quote, "Become clandestine, make rhizomes everywhere," page 211. Oddly, even so, this still looks a bit unsatisfactory right at the end of the plateau. And I quote, "Must we leave it at that? 3 states and no more? Primitive heads, Christ face, and probe heads." End of quote. Well, as a brief comment, I think this unsatisfactory nature of the analysis of the faciality system might explain its near absence anywhere else in subsequent work. For example, I can't remember offhand a single reference to faciality in Deleuze's massive 2-volume discussion of the cinema. Guattari's work on subjectivity does mention faciality occasionally, and there is a short essay on faciality at the end of his book, Schizoanalytic Cartographies, that's Guattari 2013. What this essay does is to review some portrait photographs at an exhibition by a photographer called Eiichi Tahara. The essay repeats some of the themes of this plateau, but it also discusses Barth's work on the aesthetics of the portrait photograph. The main point for me is that further deterritorialization of aspects of the face, seen in these photographs by blanking out or masking sections of the face, permits those aspects to be used for artistic purposes beyond conventional representation. Again, I have an aside on this online, so see for yourselves.